When the Founding Fathers drafted the Constitution, they feared that the president may abuse the powers of their office. To remedy this, an impeachment clause was included in the Constitution. The concept of impeachment had already existed in several individual states, and before that, medieval England. The founders drew inspiration from these sources in crafting the federal impeachment process. As per the Constitution, the House of Representatives has the sole power to impeach the president, or any other federal official for that matter, so long as a simple majority votes in favor. Furthermore, the Constitution states that individuals may only be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. If an individual is impeached, that means the House has formally charged them with an impeachable offense, and they subsequently will face a trial in the Senate. Should 2/3 of the Senate vote to convict them, they will be removed from office. The Senate may also choose to bar them from ever holding public office again with a simple majority vote. In the history of the United States, only 3 presidents have ever been impeached. However, there have been numerous failed attempts. One such attempt was made against Thomas Jefferson. In 1806, the collector of the port of Boston, Benjamin Lincoln, wrote a resignation letter to Jefferson. As collector, Lincoln was responsible for the collection of tariff revenue on imports entering through Boston, but the 73-year-old Lincoln believed he was too old and feeble to continue in the position. Jefferson refused Lincoln's resignation because he hoped to replace Lincoln with his friend and political ally, Secretary of War Henry Dearborn. Simultaneously, Jefferson wanted to keep Dearborn as Secretary of War because he believed the position was too important to leave vacant due to growing tensions between the United States and the United Kingdom over the Royal Navy's use of impressment on American sailors. Thus, Jefferson resolved to keep both Dearborn and Lincoln in their respective offices until the end of his presidency, at which point he would appoint Dearborn. However, an anti-Jefferson congressman from Massachusetts named Josiah Quincy III interpreted this situation as Jefferson enabling Lincoln to receive an annual salary of $5,000 for doing no work. During the lame duck period at the very end of Jefferson's presidency, Quincy introduced resolutions calling for an impeachment investigation into Jefferson's conduct. Although the House considered the resolutions, they were ultimately voted down by a narrow margin of just 117 to 1, because almost nobody believed that Jefferson's action constituted an impeachable offense. The first substantial attempt to impeach a president was made against John Tyler. Originally, Tyler had been selected by the Whig Party to serve as William Henry Harrison's running mate for the 1840 election. In this election, the Whigs gained control of the presidency and Congress for the first time, enabling them to enact their ambitious agenda. However, just 1 month into his term, Harrison did something unprecedented. He died. Tyler subsequently elevated himself to the presidency, an action that was of debatable constitutionality. Regardless, Whig leaders, such as Henry Clay, expected Tyler to be deferential to them and supportive of their policies. This expectation would be completely upended when Tyler vetoed a bill to charter a national bank, a cornerstone component of the Whig program. Tyler would further enrage Whig leaders when he vetoed a compromise version of the bill, leading to him being kicked out of the Whig Party. After Tyler vetoed yet another signature Whig policy, a bill hiking tariff rates to fund infrastructure projects, Congress was completely fed up. Instead of accepting the veto, Congress established a special committee, chaired by former President and now Congressman John Quincy Adams, to investigate Tyler. The committee claimed Tyler had lied to a congressman about his support for the bill, and denounced Tyler's use of the veto as a tyrannical usurpation of Congress's authority. According to the committee, these actions constituted impeachable offenses, though the committee ultimately recommended against impeachment because Tyler most likely wouldn't have been convicted in the Senate. The House voted to accept the committee's report by a 100-80 margin, much to Tyler's chagrin. Congressman John Botts of Virginia proposed establishing a formal impeachment inquiry based on the committee's report, but his resolution was voted down 127-83. After Tyler, the next president to face the threat of impeachment was James Buchanan. Buchanan entered office during a rather precarious period in American history, with Northerners and Southerners at each other's throats over the issue of slavery. This division was encapsulated by the situation in Kansas Territory. Congress allowed Kansas to hold a referendum on whether or not to allow slavery, causing many pro-slavery Southerners and anti-slavery Northerners to migrate there in hopes of tilting the vote in their favor. Violence would soon erupt between the two factions, with the whole affair being dubbed Bleeding Kansas. Amidst the bloodshed, the pro-slavery forces gathered in Lecompton to draft the Lecompton Constitution. This pro-slavery constitution was subjected to a referendum, wherein it was approved thanks to widespread electoral fraud. Buchanan, a Democrat with pro-slavery beliefs, pressed Congress to approve Kansas statehood with the Lecompton Constitution. In spite of his efforts, the measure was rejected by the House, which was controlled by anti-slavery Republicans. The whole ordeal convinced Buchanan's critics that the president was involved in a conspiracy to forcibly expand slavery nationwide and that he was using unlawful means to do so. After an anti-Lecompton Democratic congressman named John Hickman claimed that Buchanan had tried to buy his vote, the House created a committee to investigate corruption in the Buchanan administration and determine if impeachment was warranted. The Co-Vote Committee, named after its chairman, Pennsylvania Congressman and prominent Buchanan critic John Co-Vote, quickly unearthed evidence of this corruption. Large bribes had indeed been paid out to congressmen in exchange for their support on the Kansas issue, and cushy government jobs had been doled out to politicians' family members. Buchanan's administration had also supplied higher-value contracts to friendly businesses, sold property at below-market value to friends, and embezzled funds. Despite this, the Co-Vote Committee failed to find evidence definitively implicating Buchanan himself rather than his subordinates. They labeled his administration the most corrupt in history, but recommended against impeachment. Buchanan's term was also nearly over by then, rendering him a lame duck. Buchanan is commonly regarded as the worst president in American history. Only one other man might deserve that title: Andrew Johnson. Johnson was famously impeached in 1868 after he violated the Tenure of Office Act by firing a cabinet secretary without the Senate's approval. Luckily for Johnson, he avoided conviction in the Senate by just one vote. However, that wasn't the only attempt to impeach Johnson. After Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Vice President Johnson was elevated to the presidency. He quickly made himself extremely unpopular amongst Republicans by opposing civil rights and supporting a lenient reconstruction of the South after the Civil War. Many impeachment resolutions were proposed by the president's most avid critics, but they were all voted down or just ignored because of divisions within the Republican Party. Radicals hated Johnson and wanted him removed from office, while moderates really disliked Johnson but tolerated him because they believed the president couldn't be impeached for their political beliefs. One radical congressman, James Mitchell Ashley, was particularly dedicated to impeachment because he believed in a conspiracy theory that implicated Johnson in Lincoln's assassination. After conducting research into federal impeachment law, Ashley proposed a formal impeachment inquiry into Johnson. Because his proposal didn't directly call for the president's impeachment, it managed to secure enough moderate support to pass. The Judiciary Committee was tasked with investigating Johnson, and initially, the committee recommended against impeachment by a 5-4 vote. However, the committee then reversed its decision when Johnson fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, an ally of the radical Republicans. Although the Senate used the recently passed Tenure of Office Act to reinstate Stanton, the damage to Johnson's reputation had been done. The committee, in another 5-4 vote, charged Johnson with 17 abuses of power related to his use of pardons, vetoes, and patronage to obstruct the will of Congress in the enactment of Reconstruction. When the entire House voted on impeachment, it was soundly defeated in a 108-57 vote. The moderates still believed Johnson was lawfully exercising his powers as president, even if they disagreed with how he used them. Just a few months later, Johnson fired Stanton a second time, leading to his actual impeachment. And then there was Herbert Hoover. Hoover had the misfortune of being president at the onset of the Great Depression, an unprecedented global economic crisis. The Depression made it particularly difficult for countries to pay off their foreign debts. During World War I, Britain and France had taken out huge loans from the United States, which they still needed to pay off. In order to meet their payments, they used war reparations paid to them by Germany. Meanwhile, Germany was reliant on American loans to pay reparations. When the German economy collapsed in 1931, it became clear that they wouldn't be able to make their reparations payments, thus endangering the entire system. To prevent a total collapse, Hoover issued a year-long moratorium on debt payments to buy enough time to stabilize the situation. However, a Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, Lewis Thomas McFadden, really did not like the Hoover moratorium, which he saw as usurping Congress's power over financial policy. During the lame duck period of Hoover's presidency, McFadden introduced an impeachment resolution regarding the moratorium and the president's handling of the Depression more broadly. According to the resolution, the Hoover moratorium had been illegal, and by issuing the moratorium, Hoover had damaged the validity of the debts, aided foreign governments at America's expense, and disrespected Congress. McFadden also accused Hoover of committing many other supposedly impeachable offenses, like supporting debt reduction, raising unemployment and taxes, and using the military to disperse a group of protesting World War I veterans who wanted to be paid their bonuses early. The resolution also made several complaints regarding Hoover's handling of the Federal Reserve, which McFadden thought was responsible for the Depression. McFadden's resolution was voted down easily in a 361-8 vote. Because it went so well the first time, McFadden then proposed the resolution again a few weeks later, and it was tabled a second time by a vote of 344-11. Despite Hoover's unpopularity, he was never in serious danger of impeachment. This stands in stark contrast to the case of Richard Nixon. As Nixon ran for re-election in 1972, 5 men associated with the committee to re-elect the president broke into the Watergate complex, home to the Democratic National Committee. The burglars had wiretapped the DNC's offices, but were caught by security. The FBI began investigating the break-in, but was secretly pressured by Nixon to drop the case. Nixon then went on to win the 1972 election in a landslide, but the scandal persisted. Journalists, the Senate, and the Justice Department launched investigations into the break-in, and evidence that Nixon had engaged in a cover-up soon began mounting. Upon the revelation that Nixon's conversations in the White House were recorded, the Justice Department's special prosecutor for Watergate, Archibald Cox, subpoenaed the tapes. Nixon then fired Cox, and with public opinion turning against him, held a press conference where he famously said,
"I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook."
As pressure continued to mount, Nixon eventually released some of the tapes, along with edited transcripts of the conversations, but he refused to comply with congressional subpoenas that demanded the release of all the relevant tapes, citing his executive privilege. Meanwhile, the House Judiciary Committee began considering 5 articles of impeachment against Nixon: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, contempt of Congress, and 2 charges unrelated to Watergate, secretly ordering the bombing of Cambodia during the Cambodian Civil War, and tax evasion. Ultimately, the committee voted to approve only the first 3 articles. After a Supreme Court ruling forced Nixon to release the remaining tapes, the so-called smoking gun tape revealed for all to see that Nixon obstructed the FBI's investigation of the Watergate break-in as part of a cover-up operation. With his base of support rapidly disintegrating, Nixon chose to resign rather than face the unprecedented humiliation of being impeached and convicted. Nixon still faced the possibility of criminal prosecution, but he was pardoned by his successor, Gerald Ford, who wanted the country to move on from the national nightmare of Watergate. The Watergate scandal shook Americans' faith in the federal government, paving the way for the rise of conservative icon Ronald Reagan to the presidency. In 1983, Reagan authorized an invasion of Grenada to overthrow the island nation's communist government. The invasion was quick and largely successful, though Reagan's actions were criticized by 8 House Democrats who called for his impeachment. This minor impeachment attempt went nowhere, and it was soon overshadowed by a much larger scandal, the Iran-Contra affair. The Reagan administration had secretly sold weapons to Iran during the Iran-Iraq War to secure the release of American hostages held captive by Iranian-backed militants in Lebanon. Then, American officials redirected the proceeds from the sales to fund the Contras, a group of rebels fighting against the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The problem was the Contras were a bit sketchy. They were involved in the international cocaine trade and were known for committing human rights violations. Because of this, Congress had previously made funding the Contras illegal, meaning the Reagan administration had been breaking the law. When the affair was discovered in 1986, the public was shocked. Reagan claimed that his subordinates had acted without his permission, but many remained suspicious because of Reagan's well-known support for the Contras. The Tower Commission, led by former Senator John Tower, was created by Reagan to investigate how the affair happened. Congress also began its own investigation, and, in 1987, Democratic Congressman Henry Gonzalez of Texas introduced articles of impeachment. Some officials within the Reagan administration attempted to cover up the extent of the scandal, and a few top officials became seriously concerned that Reagan might be impeached. However, investigations into the affair determined that Reagan had not authorized aid for the Contras, though these findings were and still are disputed. Additionally, Speaker of the House Jim Wright wanted to avoid impeachment to spare the nation from a repeat of the Watergate scandal, which had occurred just over a decade earlier. Gonzalez's resolution was sent to the House Judiciary Committee, and no further actions toward impeachment were taken. Despite this whole ordeal, Reagan left office as one of the most popular presidents in American history. The same cannot be said for George W. Bush. On June 10, 2008, Democratic Congressman Dennis Kucinich of Ohio introduced 35 articles of impeachment covering a wide range of grievances. The first 4 articles claimed Bush had lied about his justifications for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. These articles also alleged that Bush engaged in a propaganda campaign to get Congress and the public to support the invasion. Articles 5 through 8 claimed Bush had launched an illegal war of aggression in violation of the UN Charter, and in doing so, he exceeded the war powers granted to him by Congress. Article 9 claimed American troops weren't provided with enough body armor, while 10 claimed the Bush administration had falsified accounts of troop injuries and fatalities for propaganda. Article 11 was about the establishment of military bases in Iraq, while 12 and 13 alleged that the U.S. was exploiting Iraq's oil resources. Article 14 claimed Bush had exposed the identity of undercover CIA agent Valerie Plame. 15 claimed military contractors weren't being prosecuted for crimes, while 16 attacked Bush for wasting tax dollars on shady contractors. 17 was about the unlawful detainment of U.S. citizens and prisoners of war. 18 stated the Bush administration had secretly tortured prisoners, and 19 claimed people were kidnapped and taken to countries where they could be tortured. 20 was about the imprisonment of children as enemy combatants. 21 alleged Bush was attempting to overthrow the government of Iran. 22 claimed Bush had used legal memos issued by the Justice Department to create secret laws. 23 claimed Bush violated the Posse Comitatus Act by using the military in a law enforcement capacity. 24 and 25 accused the Bush administration of spying on Americans in violation of the Fourth Amendment. 26 alleged Bush had claimed the right to violate certain laws after he signed them, and 27 attacked Bush for not complying with congressional subpoenas. Articles 28 and 29 related to the 2004 election. 28 alleged Bush had engaged in electoral fraud, and 29 alleged Bush conspired to violate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 30 alleged Bush wanted to destroy Medicare. 31 attacked Bush for failing to adequately respond to Hurricane Katrina, and 32 attacked Bush for undermining the effort to fight climate change. Finally, Articles 33 through 35 criticized Bush's actions before and after the attack on the World Trade Center. Ultimately, the House voted to refer Kucinich's resolution to the House Judiciary Committee, where no further action was taken. Although Democrats controlled the House, Democratic leaders chose not to pursue impeachment because it would have been distracting and divisive, and the Senate most likely wouldn't have convicted Bush. Ever since America's foundation, impeachment has been the subject of much debate. Much of this discourse has centered around what actions should be considered impeachable offenses. Treason and bribery are relatively simple, but what even are high crimes and misdemeanors? Usually, this term includes abuses of power, breaches of the public trust, actions that undermine the integrity of the office, and disregard for constitutional duties. From a more practical perspective, an impeachable offense is, as Gerald Ford put it, whatever a majority of the House of Representatives considers it to be at a given moment in history. While impeachment was intended as a sacred instrument of accountability, it has been unable to escape the reality of partisanship. Impeachment has become a means of waging political battles and a weapon against the presidency. The lack of clarity as to what an impeachable offense really is has only enabled this. And if history is anything to go by, then, as the presidents come and go, we can be sure to expect more presidential impeachment attempts.